Okay, so we're going to start looking at the period of the monarchy, and included in today's lecture we're going to talk about the Davidic covenant. The sources for this period are the Psalms, obviously, 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles. I just want to make a note about Chronicles. It's not just a rehash of Israel's history. Chronicles is a post-exilic book, probably or possibly written by Ezra, but it does not correct the previously written Samuel and Kings. Chronicles brings a focus on the house of the Lord and getting the people ready for the arrival of the temple, and the true temple, meaning Jesus. First Chronicles tells us about David for the purpose of telling us how the temple came to be built. So it's considered to be a priestly document. It's written from the perspective of the priesthood, and it seems to, some scholars complain that it whitewashes David, that it doesn't tell about his sin with Bathsheba, which is true, it doesn't, but it does tell about his sin in numbering the people, which led to the purchase of the site on Mount Moriah where the temple was built. So it doesn't completely exonerate David, but its focus is different, and the agenda for the writer of Chronicles is different from the agenda for the writer of Kings, Samuel and Kings. Samuel and Kings are pre-exilic books. Chronicles is a post-exilic book, so it's writing to connect the people after the exile with the people before the exile, and to help them to see that there's a continuity, that they're descendants of those people, that God is still interested in them, that there's a connection between the pre-exilic period and the post-exilic period. Okay, so the form of revelation during the United Monarchy comes in the form of the angel of Yahweh, who we've met before. The word of Yahweh to David. How many of you have read that article on the word of Yahweh as theophany? You two haven't read it yet? Have you read that article for the reaction paper?
Yeah.
You've all read it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I think it's an idea that fits better in your cultures, because Western culture always thinks of something like a word as an abstract concept, okay? But in your cultures, you're much more familiar with concrete concepts like that, and for the word of Yahweh to be actually a person doesn't seem so strange. It also connects with the New Testament, with Jesus was the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so I think it's an excellent thesis that this is not just some word in the atmosphere, but it's actually a physical person, an appearance of God, a theophany. The Holy Spirit spoke through David, obviously, in the Psalms, and also the prophets Nathan and Gad in particular. We have other prophetic figures throughout the monarchy period, but during David's reign particularly, these two are the important ones. There seems to be a genuine understanding of God through special revelation. But of course there's also general revelation in this period. Psalm 19 speaks about the heavens declare the glory of God, and so on. God holds David responsible for knowing the content of general revelation. David's Psalms tell us quite clearly that David does understand general revelation, but that David also receives specific and special revelation from God. Scholars argue a lot about the Psalms. Those of you who are doing Hebrew will know that the Psalms that we usually call Davidic are headed with this little title in Hebrew. The David, which can mean belonging to, or written for, David. It's part of the Hebrew text in all of the Psalms. The headings that are not italicized in English. Some of the Psalms have a heading in English that's italicized. That means the heading wasn't actually in the Hebrew. But if it's not in italics, then the heading in the Psalm is actually part of the Hebrew text, which means it's part of the inspired text. And whether it means belonging to, i.e. written by David, or written for David, then it must be written during David's lifetime. Now, a lot of scholars try and make some of the Davidic Psalms, especially in part 5 of the book of Psalms, book 5, try and make them post-exilic, because they're towards the end of Psalms. But I think that's an error, that if it says Le David, or if it says Le Shlomo, or Le Moshe, then it means that it was written in the lifetime of that person, either by them or for them. And so we're going to take the headings of the Psalms as dating for those Psalms. The people involved, Abiathar is involved as a priest in the first part of David's reign. David's reign, representative of the priesthood. Zadok is a representative of the priesthood in Solomon's reign. Of course, in 1 Samuel, David is the main figure. 1 and 2 Samuel, I should say, David is the main figure. And a lot of 1 Samuel is, most of 1 Samuel is preparing us for David's reign, which actually starts in 2 Samuel. Saul dies at the end of 1 Samuel, and David begins to reign, at least over Judah and Hebron, for 7 years, and then is anointed over all Israel. Nathan and Gad, the prophets, their ministry was probably not limited to what is recorded. In fact, Chronicles, I think, quotes either Nathan or Gad as one of the sources in Chronicles. I can't remember which one it is, but anyway, so they obviously not only spoke directly to David, but there were some things that they wrote down as well. It's through David that the covenant is going to become a reality. The promise of Deuteronomy is going to be fulfilled because David is God's choice. The promise it's the end of Genesis, where Jacob blesses his sons, and then he makes Joseph's sons equal in status to the rest of his sons. The promise there is that kings will rise out of Judah, okay? And then in Deuteronomy, there's God's statement about how they should appoint a king and what kind of king and how he should behave. Okay, so clearly Saul is not the one to fulfill those prophecies because he comes from the tribe of Benjamin. So the timing wasn't really right when Saul was chosen. A couple of reasons. Probably David was too young. And also their motivation for choosing a king was wrong, because they wanted a king so that they would be like the other nations. Okay? And God's plan for Israel was always that they would be different from the other nations. You know, it's something that we need to be very aware of as Christians, that God's plan for us is to be different. You know, and when we try and be like the world, we're actually compromising our Christian faith.
Was Saul set up for was set up that people might feel bad for their choice? Like you said,
God gave them the kind of king they wanted, probably to teach them what it was like to have to serve the kind of king they wanted. Saul began okay. He began in humility, and he was God's choice for the people at that time. But I think that God gave them Saul so that they would learn what it was like to serve the kind of king they asked for.
If he continued well, will he be?
Actually, Samuel says that specifically to Saul in chapter, is it 1 Samuel 13, I think. No, maybe 14. No. No, maybe it's 13 after all. Yes, it is. It's 1 Samuel chapter 13, where Samuel told Saul to wait 7 days before going into battle. And in verse 8 it says, he waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived. And
excuse me. Can I see these two students real quick, please? I won't be long.
okay. Saul went out to greet him. What have you done? Asked Samuel. Saul replied, when I saw the men were scattering and you did not come at the set time and the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favour, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. You acted foolishly, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time.
Concerning that place, ma'am, concerning that specific part, actually Samuel was wrong by coming late to the place, because already Saul is full of responsibilities to take care of the country.
No, I think Samuel was hiding in the bushes. I think Samuel was there. I think he was just hiding, waiting to see what Saul would do. Because as soon as he finished making the sacrifice, Samuel arrived. He only had to wait another minute or two. It's a test of his obedience. And he doesn't obey. He knew that it was not right for him to make the sacrifice. He's not a priest. He's not entitled to make the sacrifice. And he says, I felt compelled to offer the sacrifice. Well, it doesn't seem to think that he felt compelled. He just was desperate because the men were scattering. He didn't understand that Gideon won with 300 men. Doesn't matter how many men Saul had with him. If God was on his side, he would win. So he uses the sacrifices as a kind of magic trick. He's not really offering them in faith. He thinks, oh, if I offer the sacrifice, then God will favour me. Actually, what he doesn't realise is if I obey God, God will favour me. But anyway, the thing is that Saul says, if you had obeyed, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. And that leaves us with a big question mark, because here is Saul from the tribe of Benjamin, not qualified really to be king over Israel according to the promises. If he had obeyed, how could his kingdom have been established over Israel for all time? I'm asking you a question. There's an answer. Think hard.
I think it is possible that God would have established his kingdom. Maybe he would have chose David in later period and given him the other part of something to.
How is David related to Saul?
Married his daughter?
He's Saul's son-in-law. So if Saul had been obedient, David's children would have been Saul's grandchildren.
That would be the connection.
Now, as it was, Saul was disobedient, and David's wife Michal despised David and was barren. But if Saul had been obedient, David is still God's anointed, the one that God intended to be king. But if Saul had been obedient, Michal perhaps would not have been so hardened, and David's children would have been Saul's grandchildren. Kingdom established for all time. As it is, there's a disconnect between Saul's kingdom and David's kingdom because of this rebellion, really, this lack of obedience. Okay, so God is able to fulfill both his promises and his statements that he makes through the prophet Samuel, despite the fact that Saul comes from the tribe of Benjamin. His grandchildren would have been from the tribe of Judah, because their father was from the tribe of Judah. But as it was, he didn't have any grandchildren through David because Michal despised David and was barren. Okay. So it's through David that the covenant is going to become a reality and be fulfilled and continued. But we need to understand that Saul was God's choice at the demand of the people. The people weren't ready for the kind of king God wanted, and the man that God had chosen was not yet available, probably because he was too young. Okay, and David had some stuff to learn too. David was out there in the desert looking after the sheep, learning that God could protect him from the lion and the bear. All that was happening in David's life was preparation for his reign. So, starting in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we find out the reason why the people didn't want to continue with prophets and judges.
Sorry to bother you again. What time did your class get done?
11:20.
11:20? Okay. When the class is done, can I see you and Sarah, please? When the class is done? All right. Sorry to bother you.
Okay. Samuel's sons turned out to be bad. God did not hold Samuel responsible the way he had held Eli responsible. You know, Samuel grew up in Eli's household, so the only real example of fatherhood he had was Eli. Okay, now God held Eli responsible for his son's sins because he didn't correct them. But the only example that David had of fatherhood was Eli, and so God doesn't seem to hold Samuel responsible for the way his sons turn out. However, the whole of Scripture teaches us that parents are responsible to teach their children the right way. When the children make wrong choices, having been taught the right way, then they are responsible for themselves. And so God's complaint against Eli was that he didn't instruct his sons. Maybe Samuel did instruct his sons, but they refused to follow the instruction. Okay. At the beginning, when we read in 1 Samuel 9, Samuel doesn't seem to want to be king. He seems initially to have had the right kind of spirit of humility. He was hiding in the baggage when they drew lots to see who God was choosing. He was not kind of standing around waiting for people to notice him, even though he'd already been anointed by Samuel. So he seems to have had the right kind of attitude. But his physical bearing gave the appearance of a leader. He was taller than everybody else. He looked, he was handsome, and everybody thought, wow, this is the kind of king we want. And they found out later that the kind of king they wanted was not the best kind of king. Okay. David is apparently the exact opposite. David is so insignificant that his father even forgets him. Samuel says to Jesse, bring your sons, I'm going to anoint one of them. And he only brings 7 of them. Is this all? Yeah, there's one more. He's out there looking after the sheep. Even his father's kind of forgotten. It's just he has a kid brother. He's just little. He's cute. But surely he's not the one God would choose as king. So he's quite the opposite of Saul.